Welcome to Road to Recovery.
Welcome to Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents with Sagi Shaked. Sagi is the founder of Shaked Law Personal Injury Lawyers and is ranked as one of the top 100 trial lawyers in the United States by the American Trial Lawyers Association. With a wealth of experience in personal injury, wrongful death, and complex litigation cases, he passionately advocates for victims and has recovered multi-million-dollar settlements and damages for his clients. I'm your host, Abigail Vaca, and today's episode is Spotting a TBI After a Truck Crash. What you need to know. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Abigail. Look forward to this one.
So let's jump right in. What exactly is a traumatic brain injury, also known as a TBI, and why are they so common in trucking accidents?
Great question. So, in a traumatic brain injury, when you think about it, it has many definitions, but the definition I think that makes the most sense is that it occurs when an external force injures the brain. So that can range from a mild traumatic brain injury to moderate or severe. Those are the words the medical community uses. I hate the words mild and moderate. Why? Because they don't use a person has mild cancer or mild heart disease. It's just heart disease. It's cancer, right? But that's the lingo that we have to use. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're talking about these things, you don't need a physical hit to the head. So I think the second part of your question was why they're so common in trucking accidents. So think about trucks, for example. They're driving around, and if they have the trailer, they're about 80,000 pounds barreling down the roadway. Even if they're going 10 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour, there's going to be some high forces impacting a vehicle. So when you talk about a truck, you're going to see high forces, even at low speeds. You can have, sometimes you have the direct head impact where, let's say it's a T-bone collision where you would think two cars collide, at an intersection. You could have a traumatic brain injury from what they call whiplash, where let's say you're sitting in a car and you get rear-ended where your brain flies forward and then backwards, right? You get the whiplash effect. So a lot of times you see that. And then there's cases where you don't even see the head injury. You don't have someone bleeding at the scene. You don't have bruising at the scene, sort of like what we just talked about, the rear ender, where the brain flies forward and then backwards. And we use a lot of what they call demonstrative exhibits to explain it. That can happen a lot of times in rear end or side impacts, whether it's a car or a truck. So I would say, the key takeaway for this is you don't have to have an impact to the brain. Meaning you don't have to have a direct blow to the head when you're involved in a truck accident. You can have a traumatic brain injury without a direct blow to the head, but it can be caused from that whiplash effect.
I see. All right. So it might not be obvious. Then what are some of the immediate symptoms of a TBI that victims or their families should look for right after a crash?
So after a crash, and the reason why I do a lot of traumatic brain injury work, I've been doing plaintiff's personal injury for many years. I've been an attorney for 25 years. And I see a lot of these cases, and I've talked to doctors over the years and tried cases. And so one of the things you see a lot of is people losing consciousness. They black out, and you see that a lot in football. They get concussions. A concussion is just another fancy word for a brain injury. So if you have a concussion, the insurance companies, if you don't have a concussion, they make a big fuss. Oh, the person didn't have a concussion. They can't be brain injured. That's not true. There are other signs and symptoms that the American Medical Association, specifically neurology, when they talk about brain, we talk about neurology, and they talk about you can be confused at the scene. So if sometimes you see people who are involved in crashes, whether it's cars or trucks, they get confused afterwards because their brain has been impacted. Or dizziness, you see that, nausea, vomiting, confusion again. Those are some of the signs and symptoms. Sometimes you see people slurring their speech. Again, the brain got impacted, so they're confused. I had a case not too long ago where a guy was impacted. He was on a motorcycle, got impacted, and then went to the hospital, was there for 3 days. They called me afterwards, got out of the hospital, they called me and wanted to talk about a case. And after he talked about the case, he tells me that he remembers after the crash going to his house, speaking to his wife, and then his wife drove him to the hospital. And his wife said that's not the case. He was taken by ambulance, he was unconscious until the second day in the hospital. So sometimes people, you lose consciousness and you don't remember anything. He remembered something completely different. So a lot of times clients will tell me they don't even remember what happened to them. So that's partly like amnesia, you would say. But the gold star or the gold sign for or signs or symptoms for traumatic brain injury would be, I would think, five things. Loss of consciousness is one. Dizziness is two, confusion is three, slurred speech is four, and amnesia or loss of balance would be another one. And then one of the probably the most obvious signs is having a headache. So those are the things that I would say, are the signs and symptoms. And if someone has one of those, number one, go to the hospital because you never know if you have internal bleeding in the brain. We've had that situation in the past where a client of ours, this happened after he came to us. He didn't go to the hospital after a crash. And as soon as he called us, he said he's still having those signs and symptoms that I just told you about, which are confusion. He was throwing up, he was vomiting. I'm like, you should go get checked out, go to the hospital, tell them what's wrong with you. So just to make sure that you don't have that bleeding in the brain. And sure enough, he actually did have bleeding in the brain. And I feel good about that because I think I saved that guy's life. So the right thing to do if you're in a crash, even if you don't have insurance, if you're hit by a truck, go to the hospital, get your brain checked out. You're better off alive than, finding out you didn't deal with a brain bleed. And then who knows the ramifications of that for the future.
So, what I'm hearing is that a TBI could even show up days or weeks after the accident. And if that's the case, what are the delayed symptoms that people should be looking out for?
A lot of times, and I'll give you another case example. It's actually a pending case right now where our client, I'm not going to mention the client's name, and then I'll answer your question directly. Our client injured his back, and lo and behold, went to the hospital, said something about back injuries, back injuries, back injuries. And the client's a minor child and didn't mention anything about a brain injury. A couple of weeks later, I'd say almost a month and a half later, they started having issues. And who noticed the issues? The family members, the parents in that case, noticed the issues. They noticed that their child is acting differently, was having mood swings, was angry. And they said, something's wrong here. We knew we had a perfect child before, meaning without the injuries. And the reason they knew this, because the child would always go to school and the teachers would say he was a model child. He did everything perfectly. He didn't speak out. He didn't bother anybody. He was just a good student. And then sure enough, after this event, everything changed. You started seeing crying spells. You started seeing mood swings. So those are some of the signs and symptoms. Other symptoms you would find is people not able to sleep well. They're having problems sleeping or emotional problems like the child we just talked about, whether they're crying spells, depression, mood swings. Those are other things. Sometimes you see people having memory problems. So they're struggling, their brain is not working as well. So they're struggling to remember certain things, whether it's the crash or other things. They maybe start to go somewhere and then by the time they get there, they forget what they're doing or why they're even there. So those are some of the things. And other things are concentrating, difficulty concentrating and focusing on what they're doing, having persistent headaches. So sometimes they don't happen right away. And then you notice this a lot too, where some people will have eye issues or hearing issues, sometimes blurry vision, double vision, or spots in the eyes, and then increased sensitivity to light or noise. So if you're having that, or suddenly you can't be in a very lighted area, you always need to be in a dark place. People have that when they get their migraines or the hearing issues. A lot of times after a crash, they hear what's something called tinnitus, which is the ringing in the ears. And there's different sounds. And then imagine if there was ringing in your ears all day long. And this is what a person had to deal with. They would drive them crazy. And so they get depression. So the big, key point for this is there's a couple of different things you need to know about. Again, sensitivity to light and noise, concentration, mood swings, headaches, sleep disturbances. Those are kind of the takeaways from that question.
So, it's clear it's critical to see a doctor right away, even if there's no obvious signs. What medical tests are used to diagnose a TBI, and Are they usually reliable?
Yeah, so it really depends on the type of TBI you have. So if it's a very severe traumatic brain injury, they're going to do right away CAT scans and MRIs, and usually you'll see bleeding in the brain, and they have to operate onto someone. But if it's not a severe traumatic brain injury where the person is completely confined to a bed the rest of their life, and they have what they call, again, the words I don't like, mild or traumatic, you're going to see some other studies. So, for example, person goes to the hospital complaining of a head injury. It's protocol for them to do what they call a CT scan or a CAT scan. And the CAT scan will look for bleeding in the brain. Now, that's not the gold standard when you're trying to find out what's going on in the brain. It's the standard in the hospitals. So if you come back, in the hospital and they're telling you that it's a negative finding from the CAT scan or CT scan, doesn't mean you don't have a brain injury. It just means you didn't have to have emergency surgery at the hospital or stay in the hospital longer because the brain wasn't swollen to the point that it was picked up on an CAT scan. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other tests. So you'll see other tests. Sometimes they send the person to an MRI. An MRI is different from a CAT scan. That I would say is more the gold standard when we talk about diagnostic imaging. So if you have someone who has a negative CAT scan at the hospital and they're complaining of signs and symptoms that we just went over, you need to start thinking and saying, well, wait a minute, that person might have a traumatic brain injury. Let's get him to a neurologist, or that person should go to a neurologist and then get an MRI. And then not all MRI machines are equal. Some are different. Like not all cars are the same. You can have nothing against Kias, but we'll just use a Kia here. You can have the Kia for an MRI, or you can have a Lamborghini as an MRI. You always want to get the better MRI, meaning the better machine, higher quality, the image, the more the radiologist can see. And if you're getting a MRI of the brain, you want a neuroradiologist, not just a regular radiologist, meaning a radiologist that focused on the brain. So there's neurological exams that can be done where a neurologist will examine you and ask certain types of questions. There's also neuropsychological exams. Those are a little trickier. That's a neuropsychologist putting you through a battery of tests. And whatever the plaintiff, meaning the person who is injured, whatever their neuropsychologist says, I can guarantee you, this is in every case we've ever had in 25 years. And even some of the lawyers have been here 40 years. The defense is always going to find a neuropsychologist to say the exact opposite, because that's what they do. Insurance companies, they hire doctors who are going to say the exact opposite. And so when we talk about going back to the MRIs, think about not just a regular MRI, but diffuse tensor imaging. They call that DTI, or is the shortcut for diffuse tensor imaging. That'll pick up those micro lesions in the brain that a CAT scan would not pick up. So those are some of the tests you would see. And of course, maybe on another episode where we have more time, I'll go into specific what the neurological exams are that the neurologist does, and then what the tests are that the neuropsychologist does.
Interesting. So, if anyone persistently has symptoms, even though all of the tests were negative, do you ever recommend a second opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say you go to a neurologist and the person's still having issues, but the diagnostics, meaning the CT and the MRI, are coming back negative. That doesn't mean they don't have a brain injury. It just means it's not showing up on the MRI. And so they use other tests the neurologist does. There's QEEG, that tests brain mapping. There's VNG that'll test, more electrical, the symptoms between the axons and the neurons in the brain. It's going to test and let us know if it's there. They can test your eyes, your hearing, depending on what the symptom is. That's what they're going to test. So just because the diagnostics are negative, the CT scan or the MRI, does not mean the person does not have a brain injury. I can give you an example. We went to trial on a case where our client had a negative CT scan at the hospital and then had a negative MRI. And the jury did not buy the defense because the defense was, pounding their chests. Look, the MRI came back negative and the CT came back negative. That means they don't have a brain injury. And the jury didn't buy that. And of course, we got a nice verdict. We got a $6 million verdict. But that, and I think I've talked about that case. And if I haven't, we'll talk about it on one future episode. But so don't get discouraged if the MRI comes back negative or the CT comes back negative. It doesn't mean the person doesn't have a brain injury. It just means it just didn't show up on those scans. So I would focus on more of what the neurologist is doing, what the neurological tests show, and what the neurologist says. And that'll usually be the person, whether it's a male or female, that'll quarterback sort of the case.
I'd love to end today by talking about if someone is diagnosed with a TBI after a trucking accident, what should their next steps be both legally and medically?
Yeah, so medically, I would say is definitely go to the doctor's office and follow the doctor's instructions. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, so I wouldn't know. I can just know what the doctors say based on doing this for 25 years. But immediately, if you're having those signs and symptoms of confusion, dizziness, loss of consciousness, having memory issues, definitely go see a doctor right away. If not, go to immediately the emergency room, ideally, just to make sure they rule out, right, that you don't have something major going on and that you're having a traumatic brain injury, and then you can get treatment for that. From a legal perspective, what I would say is it's super important that you go see lawyer, and not just any lawyer, because there are differences. Just like we talked about, there's differences with the MRI. There's differences in lawyers too. In general, you would think of basketball, the younger the player, the stronger they are, the faster they are. The opposite is in the law. The older the lawyer, I don't want to say the older, the more experienced the lawyer, more knowledgeable the lawyer, probably the better they're going to be. Is the lawyer board certified, or are they not board certified? Does the lawyer lecture on the specific topic that you're going to? For example, traumatic brain injuries. Have they tried a traumatic brain injury case, or are they just a lawyer that pushes paper, and doesn't really do anything in the courtroom? Because insurance companies keep track of that. They know who's trying cases and who's not. So make sure you get to the lawyer's office, communicate your injuries to the lawyer. It's also good to keep a journal of what you're going through so you can remember, because traumatic brain injury patients sometimes have memory issues. So if you put it down on paper, it's easier for you to tell the lawyer when you meet the lawyer or when you follow up with the lawyer.
All great information. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Abigail.
Thanks for tuning in to Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents with Sagi Shaked. For more information or to connect with Sagi, visit shakedlaw.com. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite platform.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.